Rich Mizak, welcome to the DCQ podcast special sits. I'm really excited to have you on.
So am I. I'm excited to be here, Peter. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So we're doing it transatlantic today. You're in New York. I'm in Greater London. And last month I was in New York with you. I was walking around on a crutch, and I have an update for you positively on this. When I came back, I did the MRI scan, and I had a bucket handle meniscus tear and a dislocated kneecap, which explains why it was so difficult for me to walk. And the funny thing is, I was explained that actually what happened just before I went to New York was probably the dislocation of the kneecap, and I must have already torn the meniscus months ago, but didn't actually realize that that was the case. The unfortunate thing was obviously that I was told after the x-ray that you could easily walk, just keep weight on it and do well. Obviously that didn't work out. I got an operation a week ago, and now walking around a lot better and in recovery. I wanted to sort of share that with you because it's one of those things for me that, if something like that happens, you sort of are very much, happy to look at the things that you probably took for granted previously when you could walk around, and you can't for a moment. If it comes back, it's something that, you're grateful for. And your health is obviously very important. The financial health of companies and enterprises is everything relating to special situations. It's a term that is new, and it's something that when I grew up, it wasn't sort of one of the job options, being a practitioner in special situations. I don't think that probably that was the case, for you as well. Maybe we could just start with you telling us a little bit about how did you end up, in special situations and financial distress space.
Well, it's funny. I look back and it makes sense, but at the time it didn't seem as organic a move. But my first job out of college, I worked at a Fifth Third Bank in their commercial lending division. I was an analyst, and it was during a recession. And a lot of the loans that were troubled, that the bank would work out, especially if they were very important customers, they would try to come up with creative solutions that would buy time to, fix things. Those are far and away the most interesting versus the normal healthy loan that would just go, we do the annual review and all the normal practices. And then I went to graduate school, and I worked at a strategy firm, and I loved the operations side of how things actually happened. And that firm folded about a year after I joined. It was one of the top, 5 consulting firms in the world at the time. And I had an offer to go into the restructuring group at one of the big 4. And that was a big training ground back in the day. And they wanted people who had the finance banking background. I had an MBA plus an undergrad in finance plus the operations. And it was kind of a unique fit. So I found a lot of people, either they come from the CPA route and they don't want to do accounting anymore, or they don't want to do audits anymore, or they come from this kind of mix of banking and operations, typically.
And when you were in the consulting firm, did you notice that it didn't go well and that they were about to fold? Or was it, a complete surprise?
There was writing on the wall, but similar to your knee injury, kind of knocking, not seeing it coming, all of a sudden it coming, and it debilitates you. This firm had been growing for 5 years. They grew to 750 employees. They were in 16 offices all over the world, like one of the top leading firms. But ultimately, they had a partner fight over compensation. And wow. that kind of took them off track for a couple months. And, as you know, growth eats cash. So as they're growing, they a lot of the partners who've been selling a lot of work said, "Hey, I want my share. I've been investing in this company for years. Where's my cut?" Kind of thing. And that took them off track, and sort of like your knee injury, you can't not deal with it. You're forced to deal with it. And that actually sort of took them off track. And then they sold in bits and pieces, and they're pretty much gone within a year after that. But it was very much that, didn't see it coming. It's like a lot of our situations, the companies were doing okay, and then boom, something happens.
But it didn't have a lot of deep consequences for you. It actually opened up an opportunity to pivot and actually maybe make it much more your focus than it was before, going into a bigger shop. Was it Ernst & Young that you went to then?
I was at E&Y, and the big four in the US were largely training grounds. So a lot of people would go with them. They would learn modeling, they would learn the basic 13-week cash flows, a lot of the fundamentals of the business. And then they would go off to an Alex and Alvarez. I went to Zolfo Cooper, which was one of the big three in the US, they were doing Enron at the time. So they were doing large, complicated cases. Some went to banks like Blackstone or groups with large leverage finance practices.
Yeah. So maybe taking one step back, before, when you were in college, what was it that you sort of had in mind that you wanted to do? Was it, being an accountant, being a banker?
It's funny looking back. It kind of makes sense. I didn't want to be an accountant. I liked the finance and I liked the mix of operations. I double majored in finance and entrepreneurial studies because I loved how businesses work and I love learning how businesses make money or don't. And I liked the finance skill set. So I was ideally something that leveraged both of those. And I think there's a unique person who goes into restructuring. There's probably a bit like an emergency room doctor in some regards. They have to know a lot about a very broad set of information, and they need to keep the patient alive. And there's often a high risk of failure, but there's often like an adrenaline rush sort of thing, an excitement over fixing it. Because everybody I work with, they like fixing the company. They like leaving it a better place, putting it in a better place, and seeing another day.
That's interesting. And is that sort of, the way that you would describe to people what it is you do? Outsiders out of our domain is sort of the analogy of, an A&E department. I think a lot of people, associate it still with the Undertaker. You come in and sort of, bury everything. But that is not, maybe historically that was what a lot of the insolvencies were. But nowadays, that is, I think, something I have seen change a lot over 30 years that I've been in practice.
I do think if I tell people I restructure troubled companies, and I make it very short and sweet, or that I do a lot of interim management, because a lot of very good interim managers have a restructuring background, and that background allows the ability to go into a situation that's unstructured and bring structure and stabilize it. I often have to tell people, I didn't put the company in this situation. I came in after it became in that situation. Similar to my emergency room doctor analogy, I didn't put the gunshot in the patient. My job is to get it out and keep the patient alive. Because we consider it a failure in my sector if we have to liquidate a company. That's kind of the worst scenario. Because especially for a creditor, there's so much opportunity if you can keep the company going. Even if it's 60% of its former size and it continues to operate, at least they're getting back the majority of their loan. There's some recovery. It's terrible if a company has to liquidate, because if you're in a small town and that plant closes permanently, it's very unlikely that another plant of that size is going to go back in. But even if it's smaller and it continues to go, if you do the restructuring right, it should grow again and hopefully surpass its former size.
And is that something that you've seen has the abilities to do that over time that you've been in practice have increased? And do you think that, historically there were more real failures where it was just liquidation, very little return, and actually we're now in, I guess, a situation where there is a lot more awareness that you can do something earlier, and sort of the rescue culture that people talk about has actually, come much more to fruition? Or do you think that actually, what you saw, 30 years ago is still very much, the situation now? It's hit and miss, and it is, there still is an awful lot of denial, right? Because denial is, in my experience, something that you not only see with clients, but you see it also with, colleagues in a larger firm, where if you are brought in earlier, there's more you can do. But it still has the stigma of, well, let's not bring in these guys because that sets sort of the wrong tone.
Well, first of all, I think it's a very different market, at least in the U.S., than it was 30 years ago. So in the past, we would largely do these fixes within a bankruptcy. You'd enter bankruptcy, you'd fix everything you can, you'd shed unprofitable divisions, you'd sell things, you'd do all the things the company probably should have done over the last 5, 10 years, but didn't. And then it would emerge clean. There'd be often a new set of buyers, and there was a lot of people made a lot of money, investors at that time by buying those troubled assets. Well, money chases opportunity and return. So there's a lot more people willing to buy those assets. So somewhere along the way, in the 90s, you could buy $1 of assets for 75 cents. So you had a good amount of risk. By the mid 2000s, $1 of assets was probably 95 cents or $1. So there was a lot of question about whether to take on that level of risk. But also bankruptcy in the US is considered to be quite expensive. And now, kind of a beautiful thing for companies, there's a lot of people who are not burdened by taking on a hairier situation. The private credit funds, which largely dominate in the US, are happy to work with you to do an amendment, to do a waiver. In the past, they just sort of take the keys. They'd be like, sorry, we're done. Where a company has a lot more flexibility to do something out of court now than they ever had before. So I don't even mention the word bankruptcy with like an attorney. I would refer to you as a restructuring attorney. Because in the US, yes, you can file bankruptcy if they want it at the end, but 9 times out of 10, there's other structures that can be used and other levers that can be pulled to avoid a bankruptcy. So
that's right. So if we sort of try to look over the last 30 years, would you say that, the arrival of, I guess, distressed investors and the development of a secondary market where debt could be traded has been a big change, especially if you look at, maybe Europe more so than the US? It was all very much bank driven, and it still is to a large extent, but there are other players as well. That is something that you've sort of seen develop in the US when you sort of started up till now.
Yeah, so the question is, the players in the market. Look, I think the biggest change is private equity in the US and private credit. Back when I started, if a company was levered 5, 6, 7 times, that was sort of teetering on the edge of bankruptcy and would often be taken over. Private equity, they're former bankers. They do not have a problem driving their car at the red line a bit. So, a lot of the companies have 5, 6, 7 times levered. It's fairly typical, not a big deal. They also have access to private credit, which is largely in the US. It's a lot of insurance money. It's a lot of other backers who don't have to report every quarter to the government, and they have a lot more flexibility to do things than they did in the past. So you have a combination.
So what's the big difference then between like traditional banking and private credit?
Well, for the last several years, until like probably May of 2023, when interest rates went up, debt was largely free. It was very, very cheap. You could lever a company. It didn't cost much. You could get it. There's so much money available. Everything has been covenant light, pretty loose. So you have significantly more flexibility now than you ever had before. It was very, very hard. If you were in a troubled situation, your bank was going to really put the screws to you. Back in the day, they're going to take that company away. Nowadays, as a borrower, you have far more flexibility than you ever had before.
But you're saying the bank would take the company away. Would they enforce on security and, become the owner? Or would they just, sell things off, get repaid, and then a winding up of the company?
Very good nuance there. Right. They never actually took the equity, but they would use their rights in their credit agreement to put in a financial advisor and hire a lender. So they'd hire you as a restructuring attorney. They'd hire me as a financial advisor. They maybe hire a banker as well. And we would go and do everything we possible to kind of transition that company from the old owners to the new owners. The equity would largely be knocked out, gone. And then the bank would have, let's say they got 80% of their loan would be reinstated. They might sell it along the way to a distressed investor who would buy it at a discount, and then they would make the whatever the increase was. And so
they would do that through a Chapter 11, or they would do that in a sale outside of Chapter 11.
They would largely buy the debt from the bank, on kind of a secondary market.
That's right.
Outside of an 11.
Before the distressed investors were there, how would the bank, move forward? They would just, enforce on their security, have a sale of the collateral and get repaid.
Right. Well, they often, it was kind of an interesting thing because they never really want to take the equity themselves, but they could sell their loan off to one of the many parties that buy distressed debt and that are comfortable playing in that space. And those people want a seat at the table. So the bank would, we had a weird situation back in the day where we had a lot of these agent banks that in the past held, let's say, 20% of the credit agreement. Well, by the time you got to the filing, they were down to 1%. So you had an agent in name, but really they'd sold almost all of their position, the maximum they really could, to these distressed investors because they got out at 95 cents. They didn't want to wait. They didn't want to ride that wave. You don't know if it's going to go down to 60 cents, 40 cents, whatever their debt's going to go. So they would largely hold the debt. That would be their secured position. They never took an equity position. And when it's sold, their debt would be protected. Their goal is protecting as much of the principal as possible.
Yeah. So that is all in, I guess, an environment where, financial debt creates, financial, indebtedness creates opportunities. People are commercial about it. And there doesn't seem to be, enormous stigma attached to it, especially not, I guess, in markets like New York and maybe the US generally. But you've also spent time earlier on in your career in Japan.
Correct.
And it's my experience that outside of maybe, Western Europe, in a lot of jurisdictions, financial distress is still very, very stigmatized and in a negative way. And therefore, having to deal with it is not as straightforward as it may seem if you have a US practice. And you obviously, have become in your career a lot more cross-border. You may have started off with doing primarily maybe US domestic situations. But I think one change that I've seen, in practice is that, everything has become a lot more cross-border, international, and therefore usually also more complex. And the culture, becomes a feature. You have a toolbox that you can use, but you also have a mentality and a culture that you need to deal with. Your experience, the time that you spend in Japan, and then maybe, the experience that you've had outside of the US dealing with financial distress, has that sort of, have you, is there something to say there as to how to best deal with that? Because, in my experience, if you deal with a distress situation that involves other, I guess, cultures, and you do it just on the Western way, it doesn't seem to work.
That's correct. So, our experience, obviously, it builds and you learn a lot from one situation that goes to another, but every situation is bespoke in some regards. But most companies now have a global, it's no longer the old days where you could only sell to your home market. I mean, almost everybody does something international. So it gets significantly more complex. And I was working with a polymer seals and gaskets supplier to an auto industry. And obviously global, they had in Asia, Europe, and the United States. And we were dealing with suppliers during COVID. It cost them more to make the parts than the parts sold for. And obviously in automotive, it's very unfavorable to the supplier. These contracts are often terribly, they're very lopsided, they're very one-sided. So we said, look, we were gonna potentially have to force to file the U.S. entity into a Chapter 11 because one of the 5 of our major customers would not agree to this sharing arrangement. Because an automotive company like Ford will never put in an extra dollar if they think that Mercedes will benefit. and vice versa. They're always afraid that they're going to potentially be subsidizing a competitor. So we needed to get all 5 of them to agree to their pro rata share of the cost increase, largely related to the materials. Like, during the war in Ukraine, we couldn't get carbon black, which was a primary component of the seals around the windows in your car. And the German automaker came to us and said, well, fine, we'll deal with an administrator in Luxembourg. And we're like, I didn't say we're filing in Luxembourg. I said we're filing in the US, and we're only filing the US entity, and that will take down your plant. And they didn't like it. So they knew enough about it, and they used to putting the thumb screws. But knowing that how to move the chess pieces around and where you have the most advantage in order to just get them to the table. Now, the fact that they dragged it out for a year is ridiculous. They got discounted parts for another year, so it benefited them. But knowing that we could file the US in Mexico, we could file them in Delaware, we weren't going to file in Luxembourg, and that would ultimately force them to the table without having to do a potential filing of the entire group. So the ability to know how the various markets work, be willing to kind of get a little uncomfortable and find out maybe we do something in London, maybe we do something in Asia.
But that, yeah. And again, you look at it from, I guess, a financial perspective. I look at it from a legal perspective. But there is the toolbox of tools that you can use, but there is also trying to, gain the trust of the client, the debtors, the people that are actually, in financial distress. That usually isn't voluntarily, and it may very well be that it's the first time they're sort of dealing with something like that. What is it that you believe that, a financial advisor, or maybe, in your current role, an interim person that can come in as a CRO, a CFO, or an advisor to the board or on the board trying to deal with the financial distress? What is the skill that you need to have? What is mastering that trade look like?
I think there's an emotional intelligence level of remaining calm. So, and there's an aspect of that, and there's being this kind of radically honest with them and saying, look, I'm very sorry. I know nobody told you this, but this division isn't making money, or this isn't happening, or we have to deal with this. And saying, but don't worry, I've been in this situation. Let me help you get there. Often management teams, and not surprising, they're completely out of their element. They're very, very stressed. They've been getting beaten up by the lenders for the last year. They're not, and they're spending so much time on the process of dealing with the troubled debt, they're not managing the business anymore, which is further exacerbating the issue. So it's very important that we go in, we run interference. We help them, let us deal with the lender, you get back to running the company, and I can't do it without them, they can't do it without me. So there's this bit of a symbiotic relationship there. Like, they know where everybody is buried. They know how everything works at the company, but I'm never going to know their business industry as well as they are, but they're also never going to know the restructuring process as well as I do. And if we buddy together, we can move through this. So there's a lot of honesty, there's a lot of conversations that are uncomfortable, but you just sort of say, like, look, it is what it is. We are where we are. Let's move forward, and let's not argue about the past. Easier said than done.
What's your experience? Because again, I'm going back to the negative stigma that insolvency, restructuring, liquidation, even rescue, special situations obviously is the neutral term is preferred these days to refer to financial distress. But what are the causes of the financial distress? Because I think, the layperson in the street usually, associated with fraud, right? You obviously have the big fraud cases that, get the headlines. But is that what you find is, mostly the reason of financial distress? Or are there other, reasons of financial distress that actually, do not require immediate embarrassment or feeling that, you're a complete failure?
Well, first of all, I think there's two sort of different avenues when companies find themselves in distress. But I think both of them have a management team that feels a sense of shame. It's like getting a bad grade in school. Like, you're taught as a young child, that's not a good thing. and they made themselves to be president or CFO of this company. They've achieved a lot, and now the company is not doing well. They take it very personally. There's a bit of that, regardless of how it got there. But I find that there's either the exogenous event, like an industry turns, or it's just like they've been asleep at the switch for a while, which is the almost harder to deal with than some. For example, in May of 2023, rates went up. I'm dealing with a chain of sports medicine facilities now in the US. So we have a lot of physician practice management and dental service organizations. So they're roll-ups of medical clinics around the country, and they're streamlined, efficient, et cetera. But when you have a high percentage of labor and then interest rates go up, most of those companies immediately went into distress. They were perfectly fine until then, but it's because there was a change in rates. There was this exogenous event. The same thing happened with telecom back in the day. Everybody built this huge expansion of telecom, fiber, and et cetera. They all had the same model that said, if we build it, we'll make a ton of money. And in the US, everybody built these like dark fiber, we called it back in the day, which is all being used right now, by the way. And there you would go into a situation where there was a very well-run company. They had everything together, but the price fell through. Like they couldn't sell it for nearly what their model was. So again, exogenous event, couldn't control it. That's probably most typical because they don't see it coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is, it's something that you can manage, and then you need to make the assessment whether or not the business is viable. One of the things that is important in any sort of distress situation is also valuation. How do you value the assets? What is the magic to valuation? Because it drives a lot ultimately.
Correct. I mean, and valuation is tricky, right? Because you may have negative EBITDA, like, it may be a cash burning company. So theoretically it's worth zero, but in reality it isn't. There's a value that you have a plant, you have buildings, you have employees, you have contracts, you have something there. So you tend to do like revenue, you tend to do a peer analysis, you do a whole bunch of different valuations to look at it, and then you weight them. We think this valuation has more merit because it's, and then, because this, let's say an EBITDA would value it at zero or negative. So we have to do, we have to scrub the financials. Two, we have to say, if we took away all these money losing businesses, if we restructure, if we get rid of X, let's say 5% of the people, whatever the number is, how does the business look? What does that growth curve look like? We have to prove it. It has to be achievable. It can't be just a hockey stick pie in the sky. And then you do a DCF, a discounted cash flow off that. So you tend to do multiple valuations, different approaches, because no one really fits. And no one's going to question, no one's going to believe your one approach is the only approach either. They're going to want to see 5 different versions and how you weighted them and why you chose one over the other as a higher weight or a lower weight. Because it is a bit of an art. And they teach classes in school now on just this, distressed company valuation.
Yeah. But is that something that you manage when you get in the company, or is that something that you need external advice on to sort of, prepare for a restructuring?
Well, in the US, typically, we're kind of worried more about the valuation at the end. When you're about ready to emerge or something's going to happen. Obviously, we're always watching valuation out of the corner of your eye. All of our models have little unofficial discounted cash flows and forecasts and EBITDA roll forwards, et cetera, because we need to kind of know, are we in the right ballpark? Sometimes a lot of times as we're moving through the process, that we will bring in a valuation expert, but the valuation expert can't do their job until we've built a really sound business plan and a forecast that's achievable. And that takes a bit of time to do right. Now, that said, one last point. A lot of, investors, they don't want me to fix the company. They would rather buy it broken and cheap. To them, they'd rather give me a free asset. Great, I'll take it on. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a push and pull there.
Yeah, understood. Want to maybe, go back to maybe the basics of, being in a situation like financial distress, special situations, our sort of space. If I try to sort of explain it to my kids, I do use the analogy that you've used with sort of, a sick patient dealing with things that, that can be cured if you're early, and much more difficult to deal with if you're late. One thing that one of my sons immediately sort of brought up is, well, okay, if there is financial distress, how do you get paid? Right? Because you don't want to be another creditor joining the queue. Um, Obviously, it's a valid question to ask. How would you deal with that if you take on interim roles?
Well, typically, if it's truly distressed and we think it is going to go into a filing, we're often, we bring in a large retainer. So if we think our fees are going to be X dollars per month, you want a retainer somewhere around that amount and say like, look, I know you don't have money to pay vendors, but we and the attorneys need to be we need a large retainer. We'll work against that retainer. Obviously, if we don't use it, you'll get it back, but we can't take the risk that we're not going to get paid. Yep. Now, in most interim situations, you're in early enough. We bill weekly. We do other things to keep and we have a small deposit that kind of gives us some comfort. So you work out things that'll work for the client. Ultimately, if they have no money, they can't pay you. But the lenders sometimes will fund if they have to, or they'll at least allocate some of the. If you stop paying interest, you have a lot of money typically, because often the clients that come in, they're very highly levered, and that's obviously not great for the bank. But the bank wants their principal back. That's their biggest concern. I mean, obviously they like the return on the principal, but they're more concerned about the return of the principal.
Yeah. So there needs to be something to save. There needs to be some value in there for, advisors to actually descend upon the situation. Otherwise, it is, it is just a cleanup job and liquidate and, turn the page. And, the assistance as provided by lawyers and by financial advisors needs to be paid for. And it is part of, I guess, the plan that is being constructed, which again, for, outsiders may seem, whoa, those are, staggering amounts if it's, a big situation. But yeah.
Yeah, one
Sorry.
point. I mean, I think one of the things that always surprised me when I first got into the industry is that the bank is often very grateful to have a good lawyer and a good financial advisor in there, because they know that the company, they're in over their head. And having, that company is going to be dealing with that lender 5 years from now. Let them throw rocks at me. Let me run interference. Let them blame me. Let me take the heat off. But it's much better for the bank to have a financial advisor and a lawyer in there who are skilled and know what they're doing than it is to let the thing fail, because then you're much higher probability of having liquidation. So it's an odd thing that you wouldn't think they'd be happy to see you, but they're happy to see you usually.
Yeah.
Ish.
So if we sort of zoom out a little bit and go back to, I guess, your description of how the US system works, which I guess is for the world almost a blueprint for, well, rescue, right? Focused on rescue. Mm-hmm. And in the UK, we are focused on rescue as well. We have tools in the toolbox. I had the opportunity to work with the World Bank last year on one of the African jurisdictions where they're keen to also have a rescue culture. Embedded in the company, in the country, so that foreign investment in the economy is gonna increase. And it's all about transparency, right? We need to know what you can expect. If you don't have transparency, it's very hard to price uncertainty into whatever you do, and it's very expensive. But a rescue culture, what do you need for a rescue culture to actually, be implemented in a jurisdiction? You can create the best laws, but, if they're not used or nobody can actually use them because they don't have any expertise with them, it's going to be very difficult to change things in the country. Also, if there is a stigma, a mentality that has creeped in years on end, where actually, you don't deal with financial distress, but you walk away from it and create zombie companies, you need to regain, confidence from the society that actually it is okay to talk about it. It's okay to actually do something about it. And you can start again with a clean slate if you do things properly. And there is a system that allows you to do that. But what's your experience with actually dealing with jurisdictions where, it isn't as straightforward and as accepted as it is in the US, that you try to rescue a company and restructure?
Very good point. It's a lot slower, and it probably ends up costing a lot more money. The U.S. and I would say the Silicon Valley culture is what's been very beneficial to the U.S. The distress perception. There are hundreds of companies all trying to be the same Facebook. They're all trying to be Google, whatever. And one of them or two of them might make it and have some success, but most will not. And the people who build those businesses in their garage, they accept that they're going to fail. Now, I think, when you look in Germany and other countries where I think a lot of the laws had traditionally been, we need to punish you so that everyone learns you don't go bankrupt. And you have that like officer and director liability in Europe, especially. You see what happens with cash pooling. When the officers and directors are potentially personally liable for a bankruptcy, things close up very fast. And everybody hoards and they all protect. And it becomes much harder to do things because slowly countries, like let's say if most large corporations have cash pooling. So let's say your bank accounts are in London and all the countries in Europe, every morning or every night, they sweep the excess cash. And then whatever they need for the day, they pass back out. So you have a system that typically works for years, perfectly fine, and that's very efficient for management of your cash. But when you're in a distress situation, all of a sudden the officers of Germany, of wherever, start locking down and turning off the spigot, so to speak. So you need the cash to restructure, but you can't because it's trapped in that country. So there's little quirks that happen due to the laws in that respective country. I also think countries that have very restrictive laws tend to have less entrepreneurship and less growth because, if I'm not going to go build a business with you in my garage to be the next Facebook or whatever, if I think I'm going to be permanently banned from ever working again in the finance industry.
Yeah, it's sort of typical thing that you hear is that it's almost like a badge of honor in the States that you've done a Chapter 11. It shows that you actually have been active and doing stuff, trying things out. And, after a number of tries, you get, maybe the successful one that actually works. But it's part of the life cycle of businesses that you take risks and sometimes they materialize and you need to move on. It's very interesting to see what the sort of culture is, the business culture. Even though there is a rescue culture and lots of improvement, I think, in the UK and Europe over the 30 years that I've been in practice to do a lot more. Still, it has a negative stigma. And still, I feel that the encouragement to do something off the beaten track is always, received with skepticism and with notes of caution in Europe and the UK, and actually almost always with, cheers and applause and, in the US.
I don't know if we it's funny, you said a badge of honor. I mean, if you ask an executive who went through a bankruptcy, I don't know if they think of it as a badge of honor. They often say, that's nothing I want to do again. They might say, I'm glad I learned about it. I don't want to do it again. Typically they say, I learned a lot.
It's not supposed to be a pleasant experience, right?
No, if you're going to walk away from a lot of debt, they're not going to make it easy. They probably shouldn't also. Absolutely. But I do think the rescue culture is, I think, when people learn from what other people have done. So when in Europe, when they can point to the US and say, well, that company restructured and saved 700 jobs in that town, that's a good thing. Think that a lot of the European, let's say if you're a company in France and you have 1,000 employees and they say we have to go through a safeguard and do a restructuring, say, but we're going to be left with 700. They might say, oh, that's terrible. We went from 1,000 to 700. They're like, yeah, but your alternative was 1,000 to 0. And that region might be permanently disabled. And so I think if you're a local politician and you're saying, well, the bank can take a hit and I can keep 700 jobs in my district, I'll take the 700 jobs. They would they realize that that's much better long term for them to like work out a deal and to not tie the company in knots. Now that's easier said than done. And France, for example, has a lot of very challenging laws to work with on that. But, I think more and more they realize it's better than what they were doing before.
Yeah. So how do you change mentality then for the better? Is it by facilitating practitioners with the right tools? Is it academics coming up and teaching the next generation things? Is it supranational organizations like the World Bank and UNCITRAL coming with model laws that you can implement and putting, I guess, insolvency more on the map? What is it that you need to actually have success?
Well, look, I don't think the government will ever be the leader. I think they will follow the lead. And that's where I think organizations like INSOL, which are groups of practitioners around the world saying, hey, this worked in the US, let's try it here, and pointing to it. And then INSOL coming up with a framework that allows courts to work together to figure something out, gives the judge, like if I'm a judge in Europe, like I'm not gonna do anything counter. Why would I do something that might benefit another country? I have to care about my country. But if I can point to a law and a structure, aha, I have some cover. I can do it the right thing. We have an agreement here. We get all the parties to work together. We appear to have competent parties on both sides, or as many countries as possible. Each of these parties attests that they have taken the consideration of the X number of countries that are involved in the situation. So I think like groups like INSOL are hugely valuable, but INSOL is really just like a single voice for the insolvency industry, right? Globally. Yeah,
exactly. But okay, it facilitates communication between, I guess, lenders, judiciary, practitioners, and that does help. I mean, we've seen it, in practice quite a bit. So no, I take the point. So rescue culture, to me, very important. It is something that I have seen develop over the 30 years, significantly. You've been in large organizations and in smaller organizations. What was it to be, part of a large organizations? And have you seen these large organizations actually change in the time that you've been here? Law firms in particular, I think, have all become either very small or very big. And within the law firms, you have seen that insolvency, special situations, has become a practice on its own. While, in the past, it was like a bolt-on to other main practices that are there. And in that respect, I think the fact that internationally cross-border insolvency with the model law on cross-border insolvency, has also shown that Working Group 5 dealing with insolvency and harmonization, modernization of insolvencies has put it really on the map as a profession on its own. Have you seen the same development on your end in sort of, the large firms of, like an Alvarez and Marsal, like an Ernst & Young?
Well, I think, back when I started, restructuring was more of a boutique skill set. Alvarez in the 90s was probably 50, 60 people. Now I think there's 7,500. And the restructuring is a small part of the larger business because they largely diversified, right? Because restructuring is very cyclical and similar to law firms, right? You might have a very strong bankruptcy department, but that bankruptcy department probably relies upon, contract lawyers, litigators, real estate, other divisions within the firm. So there's sort of a symbiotic relationship. We often bring, the financial advisors, we often bring in litigation support or valuation experts, which often tend to be a different division. So there's been sort of a maturation of the market, but I think also because of the cyclicality, a lot of people are diversified. I've been doing a lot of interim management lately because I think that it has a higher trading multiple, frankly, than traditional restructuring. But also people who do restructuring tend to be very good at interim management because they're used to unstructured situations and they're comfortable in those.
That's right.
So there's a market sort of evolves, it kind of moves.
Yeah, but it is something that stands on its own at the moment as a profession. It's not Correct. A bolt-on to anything else anymore. It actually could be on the list of jobs to consider on its own. Not, usually
Correct.
it was like, you could be a lawyer and then maybe you be a corporate lawyer. And some of the corporate stuff that you do is distressed and sort of, you end up in maybe restructuring, or you're a finance lawyer, right? You need to refinance a situation, or there is a rescue finance that needs to be done. Boom, you're in special situations. Or you're a litigator, do all kinds of litigation, and it could be litigation relating to formal insolvency proceedings. But now it seems you can actually have a profession that is exclusively special situations. Or do you actually think, no, that is just in a number of places in the world that you can do that, but most of the time you need to do other stuff as well because it is so cyclical?
I think the cyclicality is what makes it hard to be a full standalone business. Obviously, there are in the US, especially, there are certain boutiques and they're good size and they're very sophisticated. They tend to build out valuation, lit support, other ancillary services, mainstream consulting, simply because they want to balance out that cyclicality. But I think the skill set of someone in restructuring is pretty unique. And you need some of those people. The question is the balance and how much of a mix of your firm's revenue. The law firms, I think, are very, very good at this. They say, well, you're a corporate lawyer and you do contracts and you do financing, but we're going to give you a couple hairy things to work on, but you're going to also work on healthy situations as well. And you're going to learn a lot from that, but you might stay in the corporate group, but do a lot of distress. So they realize that that's a complementary skill set to have. And having a little cross fertilization isn't a bad, for your skill development.
Yeah. One thing that is very typical of, I guess, distressed space is that it is urgent, right? You were referring to, there's a rush, there's pressure, you need to drop everything and go for it. How does that sort of make it, how does then your profession become a part of your, the rest of your life? Does it sort of take over your life if you're in this profession? Or is there a way to actually, deal with it in a way that allows other things as well? Or is it just, well, okay, if you're in this profession, it's 24/7, 100%, and everything else takes a back seat?
That's a very good lie. I mean, I've seen a number of people leave over the years because when a case files, it can be 20. I mean, when Lehman Brothers files, I'm sorry, you're working 7 days a week for the next 6 months or year. Like, it's too big and too hairy a situation. Now, the people who worked on that engagement made a tremendous amount of money. Their spouse or significant other, the second year was probably happy, but that year they didn't see much of their spouse. I think, we used to joke that I have to have my laundry done, my dry cleaning ready to go, and a piece of luggage ready, because they would say, Monday at 1 p.m, I need you on a plane to St. Louis tonight, and whatever. And you go, okay. And you didn't know where in St. Louis. You just knew you had to book a flight to St. Louis. You'd run home, pack your bag, and you were flying to St. Louis. And hopefully before you got to you'd have the address of the company would be sent to you, and you'd book a hotel room and you'd be at the company the next morning. That was not atypical. I think some of the way that the Alvarez, Alex, Zolfo, they used to deal with it is Monday to Thursday, we would be on the ground at the company. Friday, we'd be back at our head office. And that's 3 nights away from your spouse. Now, the guys I work with, the people I worked with, they didn't care about working until 2 a.m, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday night, because they wanted to get as much done on the ground as possible, because they knew that there is a situation where if you're on the ground 5 days a week at the client, that's 4 nights away from your spouse. That's hard. And that's where the divorce maker kind of can come in if you're not careful. Yeah. So I think it's very important that it's finding that right balance for you, and obviously managing your relationships, and that sort of thing.
And how do you do that? What's sort of the secret to making it work?
I think it's open communications with your spouse and your family and working it out. It's funny. I have a lot of coworkers, and they would say, like, you're never home, you're never home, you're never home, and then the project ends suddenly, and because we often stop pretty suddenly, and then all of a sudden you're free all the time. And then a couple weeks later, the spouse is like, are you going to get another project? Because, I play tennis with Trudy on Monday night, and I see my other friends on Tuesday night. Because the spouses have to kind of work out a balance that works for them. And it gives each of one of them a little bit of alone time, but they still have the 4 nights together and most of the weekend, etc. So I think it's very important that that weekend time is with your family or spouse, understanding that you might be on phone calls or email for a couple hours on the weekends too, but you do whatever you need to do to keep it ready.
So it is something that you need to actually enjoy doing, right? Because it's going to be difficult to sustain this if you don't have passion for the job. And it's a kind of job that well, it's actually not really a good job. It's more like a career. It's something that you can't do 9 to 5. It just doesn't work.
That's a good point. It's funny. I had lunch or dinner with a friend of mine a couple weeks ago, and I said I love what I do. And he told his friends at work, he's like, I was talking to this guy. He said he loves what he does, and they were all like, "Oh, that's like an unknown concept," And I'm like, people who go into this work love what they do. They're very passionate about it. And if you said, "Would you want to go sit down at a desk and do the same thing every day?" They would be like, "No, no." Even though there's a high risk of failure, it's very hard, it's extremely demanding, the hours are long or can be long, you tend to be running around with your hair on fire or sitting around waiting for the phone to ring. There's sort of no in between. But people who work in the industry, there's a common vision and passion, and they love what they do. They wouldn't do it. I know a lot of people who wouldn't do anything else. They could never go back to a normal 9 to 5 desk job.
So maybe then honing in on people in the special situations arena, what kind of characteristics do they need to have? Do you think they need to be entrepreneurs? Do they need to be managers? Do they need to be technicians? Do they need to be salespeople? Do they need to be, well, what do they need to be?
Well, I think there's a little bit of everything. And that's the hard part, is because you have to have enough operating understanding. You don't have to run the plant, but you have to know what the levers are within the plant. And you have to have enough financial expertise to build a 13-week cash flow and to build a financial model and to see how what's happening in the plant is going to impact the financials. And you have to be a bit of a chameleon, because you're talking to a board of directors one day and then you're talking to the guy on the plant floor the next. So you have to be able to move between all these different worlds. So I think we're very good generalists with that subset of dealing with it in a distressed situation. And we're often unusually calm. That's the one thing that clients say to us, the world's on fire, we're running out of money, we can't meet payroll. How are you people calm? And I think a lot of us realize if we're upset and we're stressed, we're not going to be effective. Now, doesn't mean that we don't feel it. I mean, you could feel the tension in the room a lot of times at these situations. But you're able to say, this is what we're going to do. We've got a plan. We're going to keep pushing forward despite all these pressures. Otherwise, the whole thing's coming down. So we're very good at keeping focused on the 2 or 3 things that drive a process forward. And I need you going to the court telling them don't turn off the power, but you need me to tell you how much is the power bill? How much cash do they have? And this symbiotic relationship with the lawyer and the financial advisor and the legal professional is very strong.
Yeah, multidisciplinary. I mean, it's funny that you say it from your end. I would say exactly the same. The legal end. It's almost like you're in the gym of the law, right? I'm specialized in financial distress, but I need to deal with all kinds of areas of the law that are in the financial distress. It could be corporate, it could be finance, it could be litigation, it could be environmental, employment, and it could be tax. It's a lot. So real estate. So you need to be able to work with others on situations, and one of the things that is a big lesson learned for me, looking back over the last 30 years, is for a special situations lawyer to be successful, I think you also need to be very good in knowing what you don't know, right? Because it is important to have confidence, but you also need to know the limitations of your own sort of hands-on expertise. And part of your expertise is to identify where you need to bring in others. And obviously you need to do that. And I think that's a skill that you need to learn over time, but it's a very, very important one, I believe, in our space.
There's two things that maybe came up there was I check in a lot. So my clients are like, I'm like, this is what I think. Here's my, because I was very trained, don't be a hip shooter. So I'll do my analysis. I'll go in with my hypothesis of what I think the situation is, and I'll review it with management. This is what I think. This is how it appears. This is what I think we should do. And then they'll say, well, they'll tweak it usually, and then we'll move forward. And I realize some people just drive forward, and I'm like, that's kind of dangerous because like I might miss something. I don't know. And on your earlier point, I was talking to an attorney at Weil Gotshal a couple years back, and he said, like, there's never the same. Every deal, every case is different. I always have to create a new argument document. It's very frustrating. It takes a lot of time. And I'm like, I know people who used to do printing press leases or airplane financing, and that's all they do. And they know an airplane financing contract really well, and they know what the little levels are typically done. I'm like, well, why don't you go do that? You'll do the same thing. You'll be an expert in airplane leases, and you'll know which part of the contract. And they go, oh, I couldn't. I'd be bored to death. I couldn't possibly do it. Yeah. So we sometimes complain about like an aspect of our job that's the nature of our job, but we often love that aspect of our job that it forces us to learn all the time.
So how do you then, you come in a situation, the house is on fire, there's lots of things that need to be done. How do you prioritize? How do you actually know which are the few couple of things that you need to do first?
Well, there's a lot of analogies that we'll use, stop the bleeding, whatever's killing the patient. Our job is to keep the patient alive. And usually bleeding is in the form of cash. So anything that's leaking cash, draining cash, impacting our ability to collect cash, or, we're wasting cash on things that don't make money, that's our number one focus. Because that's what keeps the patient alive. That's the equivalent of blood in a human body. So we're very, very focused on what are those things. It's very much like a healthy situation as well. There's hundreds of good things to do that are beneficial, but they're not the highest priority. So you have to track what are the 2 or 3 things that I can get done and focus only on those things. And if you're focused on 10 things, I'm forgetting the author of this book, but he basically said if you have 2 goals, you'll accomplish 2 goals. If you have 3 to 4 goals, 1, maybe 2. If you have more than 4, probably 0. So you might as well just focus on the 2 or 3 things and get those across the line and do what you can to keep the patient alive and just try to prioritize. And priority is normally, it's cash. Does this generate money or is this leaking money?
Yeah. And lesson learned as well is, doing nothing is doing something, right? So,
correct.
Then you don't have control, but you let it be controlled by others. And, making decisions based on imperfect information, well, that's just what it is, right?
Correct.
You need to do that. And it's important that that you're able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I joke, I'm an Aries, and they say Aries are very good at dealing with, they'll have 80% of the information and they're happy to run through a wall. And then that's very true with restructuring people. It's like, I can't wait to do a 6-week study or a 12-week study and say, we're going to study the situation, we're going to analyze it, we're going to come back with our solution, and then we're going to agree on a new scope of work for the next several months. Like, my patient will be dead. Like, I have to do what I can to patch it together and keep it moving forward and hope that, I've been doing this long enough, our judgment is usually correct. And you do what you need to do to kind of move the company forward. And sometimes an 80% fix or a 60% fix is enough to keep the patient working and then alive. And then if you want to come back and do the last 20 or 40% later, fine. But you've actually done the heavy lifting.
So where do you, because where do you get the confidence to actually make that call, right? Are you ever in doubt, or are you constantly in doubt? To be really honest, for me, it is always, you're in doubt, but you do need to make decisions and move forward. But you just need to find a way to deal with, I guess, the negative that is always, on one hand, whispering in your ear, you have not enough information, you can't make that call, but well, we need to, right? It's sort of a lesson learned over time. but it's not because you're acting with confidence that you're always full of confidence, right?
Yeah, and I don't think it's acting. I think there's an aspect of, so there's a healthy company situation and a distressed company situation. I've kind of worked with both. In a healthy situation, when you have a change to make, and people fear change, naturally, that's how we are. And you might have the best solution. It's clearly right. Everybody agrees it's the right solution, and they will fight you tooth and nail. They're like, well, it works now. So what if we have 20 extra, employees? Like, well, it's great. When a company is in distress, they're like, fine, we'll do it. Because they know that they need to do what they need to do to keep the patient alive. And all of a sudden, the people that were fighting you yesterday at the healthy company, when the back's against the wall, suddenly they all link arms. And there's a lot of politics, as you could imagine, in companies. So, everybody wants the same golden ring. So a project that Peter has in his department, I may not be willing to support because I want the same golden ring that Peter wants. And so I may not help you. But when in distress, suddenly they're like, oh, Peter and I are friends. We link arms, and a ton gets done in a very short period of time. So you have to keep that momentum going. So you pick the 2 or 3 things, you get those 2 or 3 things done. Everyone has to agree what those are. Like, I don't come in and just say, you have to do this. I have to say, I think we should do this. I think this is our best return, and here's why. We all agree, and then we all march forward.
Yeah. So, look, paralysis can sometimes be a good thing, because if you then come in and actually set the agenda, and there is, united support for it because the pressure is there and you need to move forward, you can actually get things done.
Well, I don't want the company to go into a financial distress situation. Ideally, they should have dealt with these things years ago. Sometimes things happen that, you're operating a telecom company. Your board said you had to buy these other companies and grow because that's what all the other telecom companies did. And if you didn't go along, they'd fire you and replace it with somebody who would. And then it's very easy for that board a year or two later to say, I can't believe you did this to us. And say, well, wait a second. You approved the acquisitions. You approved the pricing. You approved this. I did what everybody else was doing. We didn't know. But now let's fix it. Let's do what we can to salvage as much as possible and kind of get this company onto a healthy framework. But there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of other things that happen. But most people understand, like, keeping the company going is in as much of a whole as possible is the best for everybody. And I think when you get people to that focus, things happen.
And so we said that regardless or whether there is a rescue culture or not, people feel if they're in that situation of financial distress that it's personal and it's very quickly, well, at least felt as a failure. What's your view on failure more generally? And are there sort of challenging situations that you've had in the practice that you sort of overcome that provide lessons for, I guess, anybody working in special situations that deals with financial distress?
Look, I think it's a very competitive world. It's very hard to make a ton of money and just sit around. Because if you're making a gob of money, everybody else is going to come in and jump in the same pool as you and fight for those same dollars. Things like, I was working with a biotech company that had operations in Europe and the US, and they sold globally. And it was you're in a constant struggle for try to get more efficient everywhere you're going. And sometimes, the market, the last few years for smaller biotech companies has been very challenging, and the customers dried up. So there's certain things that happen that are sort of outside you, and you have to explain to people, this isn't just you. This is happening across your sector. Like in the physician practice management business where I'm in now, it's the company. I have a company that's doing great relative to its peers. Now, if you look at it alone, you might say, oh, it's not doing so well. But compared to its peers, it's probably in the top 5%. But that industry is just under tremendous pressure. So there's a bit of time in educating people on what's going on. But it's hard to make money. It's hard to make money repeatedly and consistently. So it's a constant grind. You're getting better and better. And you're constantly fixing parts of the machine to tune in tighter and tighter and stronger and stronger.
And how difficult is it? Because if you're in a tense situation where, pressure is high, stakes are high, and you need to, make decisions. Have you ever had to deal with complaints, threats of complaints, claims, and how do you deal with that?
Oh, all the time. Unfortunately, all the time. You know, I was CFO of a vitamin company, and we had to let go about 20% of the staff. They just had never taken any of the band-aids off, so to speak, and we're in a very tough situation. And I, didn't want to do it, and we had to do so. Now the company survived and actually broke even cash from making. They were losing a lot of money, and it was just unsustainable in its current route. A lot of people threw rocks at me, said it was terrible, so and so, but later they're like, it was the right thing to do. I mean, does anyone want to do that? No. But to save the 80% of the jobs, yeah, I'll do that repeatedly. And the board and the CEO and everyone signed off, and the company was actually quite a bit better for it. The hard part for me is when you go, there's cutting fat and cutting muscle, right? So I want a division to get as efficient as possible so that it's making money, and you might go part by part around a company, versus just take 20% off the top or 10% off the top, because now you may actually hurt the business more than help the business. So it's a very interesting tightrope that one walks when they do this work.
So if you do that work, do you need to have, good insurance in place just in case somebody actually has a go at you and files a claim?
Yeah, I mean, look, in the U.S. it's very litigious. So we always have directors and officers insurance. We're indemnified. That's actually a big part of it in our engagement letters, to make sure that we're covered going into these situations. But 9 times out of 10, at least in the U.S., it's employee at will. People understand. They're not happy. We're not happy. We paid that employee for a lot of time, a lot of money for many years on the belief that that would be a very profitable thing. We're losing way more, but the best thing, if you're respectful and honest with people and you tell them why and you try to do what you can as far as severance, we've hired back people. We've hired people that were let go at other companies. We refer them to other jobs, and people do what they can to try to help people where they can.
Yeah. So maybe take an opportunity to sort of look forward. I mean, you're very much still in the business, and I don't think there are any plans to stop. The same applies to me. Do you think that having looked at the changes that took place the last 30 years, if we sort of extrapolate another 10, 20 years, what are the big changes that you think are coming down the pike in our space that we need to be aware of?
I think the biggest thing to be aware of, and this is possibly, I don't know if this is just US, but a lot of restructurings are financial restructurings now. Because it's very easy to a bank to go in and say, okay, we're going to take 10%, 20% off your debt, we'll give you a haircut, and we'll move forward. It's a lot harder to go, we're going to go fix the core business and operationalize that. And that takes a lot of time, and it can take months, and you're working with teams, and you're driving work streams, and you're project managing a lot of stuff. I think companies that aren't willing to go and maybe invest a little to make sure that they get those operational improvements, they're going to have, in the US we call it Chapter 11, and a second time it's a 22, third time it's a 33. We're probably going to have a lot more of those. I think that's going to happen where they didn't deal with the underlying issue because it takes time and it's complicated, and they'll have to pay back the lender. And at some point the lender is going to say, I'm done. I'm going to take my keys. So we have there's $4 trillion of dry capital right now in the market. So that's great if you're an executive of a company that's as highly levered. That's fantastic, because you've got a ton of people willing to buy and a ton of people willing to invest, which you didn't have 30 years ago. And I'm curious how that cash flowing around is going to impact companies going forward. I'm not really sure. So
liability management exercises as a consequence of, almost no covenants to be seen in any finance documents. Is that going to continue, you think, or is that going to change?
I thought they would have slowed down, but they've actually just continued. So what I do from a financial advisor, my advice is, if you as a lender are going to put in $30, $40, $50 million of additional new capital into this company to bridge it from point A to point B, And management has said, if you give me this money, we're going to do these cost improvement programs. They're going to, this money will last me 3 years. I'll be fine. Normally, it's done around the guise of the market is down for, let's say, shipping companies right now. I just have to get another year. The prices will return, will be good. I would say hire a financial advisor with operations experience to go, vet your plan. So this way it's not you, just you, the management team. Now there's a third party verifying it. 2, project management and run those work streams and validate them. Because the worst thing you want to do as a lawyer or banker is to give them $30 million, $50 million, and then 6 months from now they come back and said, hey, Peter, that money that was supposed to last me 3 years? Well, we kind of spent it all. Like, that's bad for you and that's bad for the company. So I think there's a way to do a restructuring without doing a bankruptcy, without doing an official restructuring. You're out of court. You get a little bit of extra cash by the liability management exercise. You preserve the capital of the people who are in that pool, obviously the chosen pool, and obviously you give the company the best chance of success. But I think we're going to have more and more of them. Yeah.
Where are the warning signs to know that it's spent in the way that it needs to be spent if there are no covenants?
Well, I would say, in order for me, if Peter, if you had a client, Peter, and you're doing the legal work, and you had a banker that was going to help do the liability management, you're going to raise $50 million. I would say, I think you should have someone come in, verify the plan, help you with the plan, build out those work streams, whatever they are, and validate that they're really going to get the savings they're going to get, that they say they're going to get. And then you can say, they might come back and say, I wouldn't give them 50. Or they can say, yeah, no, that $50 million is going to be money well spent. We think we can get an additional X amount of dollars out of this company. If you think about it, someone who works at a company, they're so busy in the day-to-day, they don't have extra time to run 10 extra projects. So sometimes having a third party in there running just running the traps, checking in, project managing these projects, help drive them, and reporting back to the lenders is a very valuable and I think a very worthwhile investment, because usually it's a very tiny percentage of that money, but it ensures that the money that you're putting in is not wasted or squandered.
Yeah. So having somebody on the inside.
But we're going to have far more. I think we're going to have more and more of them, because there's so much money chasing these things, and the only way for the lenders to make money is to kind of knock out someone else in the pool.
Yeah, I think one of the issues there, tying back to what we discussed at the outset of our conversation about, directors' liabilities, the flexibility you have to do certain things. If it's a cross-border organization and it's, run out of the States, but it has knock-ons outside of the States, the liability management exercise, then the boards in the various other jurisdictions may need to be aware of what's going on. Whoever comes in to sort of streamline things for the lenders will need to check in with the various jurisdictions to see whether or not it doesn't trigger any issues there, while maybe, in the US, it's fine.
I don't know if it's fine in the U.S. I mean, I think it's lawyers are making a lot of money on it, right? Because you make the money on structuring the transaction, then inevitably people are sued. So then the law firm makes some money defending the situation that they just structured. And then if it does end up in a filing, they can say, we want to do the filing for you. Unfortunately, the lawyers make a lot of money in that situation. And granted, I'm not blaming the lawyers. They're being asked by their clients to do this. And these are companies that have under all of their credit agreements, they usually have no more availability. So they should not be granted an additional $30, $40, $50 million, whatever the number is. So that it's the only way to get money into the company, because no one's going to lend additional money, fifth in line to this company. So these companies need the cash. It's like a dip in some regards. Understood.
So, and then I guess the inevitable sort of topic that always comes up these days is AI, right? Is that going to be the tool that everybody needs to have handy? Is it going to be widely used in our space? Is it going to change our space completely? Obviously, with the amount of information that goes around in complex situations, you can immediately see that an AI can actually have benefits But on the other hand, an AI is not a human being. A lot of these things also involve, I guess, judgment, as we said, empathy, creating trust and confidence. All of these things are very important as well. I can't see an AI actually performing that job for us, for example. What are your views on the AI focus generally and in our profession specifically?
And in our profession, it's trickier, but I think we are going to be the beneficiary of the impact of AI on certain companies, because certain companies it won't make sense to have that many people anymore, doing certain things that can be automated. And the companies that have adopted it and have become more efficient, they will be fine. The ones that haven't, those will become clients of ours because they didn't adopt. I mean, there isn't a board of directors, I probably globally, that isn't asking, what is your AI strategy? And the one thing that we're often pointed to is, what was your what was your social media strategy 10, 15 years ago? And they thought they didn't need one. And then their employees post pictures of like the inside of their plant. Their confidential technology is being posted behind Sally on the plant floor. And they realize we have to have a social media strategy. Companies realize they have to have an AI strategy and deal with it. I think we're going to see the repercussions mostly in the form of industries turning upside down. But we're using it in select areas, and whether it's true AI or not, like for example, if I go to an accounts payable department and they have 10 people, I can probably put in, we call a bot, like a robot. It's really a software program that scans invoices, pulls all the sensitive information, puts it into the system. You can create the journal entries. It'll see if it's a valid invoice. It'll match things up, everything. And then you can go down to 3 people or 5 people instead of 10. Is that AI? Maybe. It's kind of optical character recognition in a program, but like some of those low-level jobs that are very hard to find people for anyway, like I think we're going to get continued efficiencies as people figure out how to use AI to take out some of those jobs that a lot of people don't want to do. I mean, it's very tedious going through accounts payable invoices and making sure every single digit's perfectly and matching things up. So I think we're going to see more and more automation related to it in that area. But if you're the old company that doesn't have AI in your software, you're in big trouble. I don't know if I've answered the question or not,
but I think you've given some food for thought, which is helpful. Tariffs is the big thing today, right? Do you think that is just, a temporary thing and it's going to sort of blow over and it's not going to have a huge impact on, I guess, our space? Or do you think actually it's the start of, something that maybe has been building up already for a while, but this may be the trigger because of, the chaos that this is creating?
Oh, I think it's the start. I mean, I think, let's say that even if the tariffs come down, in the coming weeks or months, I think the damage caused is not going to be easily undone. I do think it's caused a lot of, at least in Europe, US and Europe, companies to rethink their supply chains, rethink how they do things. But it's very hard. Once, I grew up in Connecticut, small state, used to have a ton of manufacturing 100 years ago. Cannonballs, swords, precision brass timepieces that were used in torpedoes, unique things that are now automated and not made here anymore. And once those industries leave, the guy who used to sell you the hoses that went on your hydraulic equipment had a little plant, a little office, the person who used to tune this equipment, all these little sub-suppliers that support the larger have gone. So the ability to just like flip the switch and go back to doing things the way we used to do it 100 years ago, 50 years ago, is not there. So I think it's going to be an interesting period for the next 10, 15 years, possibly accelerating what was probably going to happen anyway in some regards.
So it will, and it will come up with new prices that we need to get used to, and that's going to be it, right? We're used to prices that have cheap labor in them. Right. We're used to prices where, what you pollute isn't actually included in the price. And all of that needs to sort of adjust itself. And maybe we'll go back to manufacturing in the US, in the UK, and and have different prices for goods that now are, priced a lot cheaper simply because we're using, I guess, supply chains worldwide. So we're going to go, much more territorial as opposed to, I guess, international.
I think it's raised awareness of we have built over the last 30, 40, 50 years an extremely complex supply chain. For example, we're looking at what is the tariff impact on our company. And it's a sports medicine. They do a lot of injections with certain, let's say in your knee, you might have a certain drug that's put in your knee to help deal with the pain or to deal with something. Though the subcomponents of that are probably made in China, even though they're mixed in the US or Europe. And there might be 20 ingredients in that formulary. Well, one comes from one country, another one comes here, they go all over the world, and you realize, well, maybe we need to come up with a simpler formulary than that 20 ingredient formulary that's not as reliant on one country not being an issue. At the auto parts company, carbon black comes out of the Ukraine, which is a big component. And it's the other countries can't just flip a switch and make more of it. They produce a large percentage of the world's things. So we have this very complex supply chain. And people are looking at it, they're like, the product started where? I mean, if you looked at the complexity, the spider web, and not just like your initial supplier, but the supplier down the line and a couple suppliers back, it's a very complicated web that we built. And it's not.
But are we then undoing globalization and going national and regional again, while actually technology and everything has made the world a lot more interconnected? We're now sort of, shutting the borders and looking very much at our own sovereign jurisdiction, our own laws. But while, a lot of the things are, as we know, not subject to one law, if we use, I guess, the globe and the interconnection there is in the way it is, how do you sort of, go back to what it was prior to globalization and prior to, all the technology that has allowed us to be a lot more cross-border?
First, frankly, this whole idea that we're going to come back to doing everything in England or everything in the U.S. like overnight is ridiculous. It's not going to. You can't happen.
Absolutely not.
You would destroy every company probably. So we're going to stay global, but I think there'll be a lot more emphasis on. Yeah, where are we getting that thing? Why are we doing this? Do we need to do that? And maybe, Europe and some things that in the US where things have, we don't make, and they say, okay, hey, we need to make some of our content here. And there's a greater emphasis I think it was just sort of assumed, I pick up the phone, I ask for 50 pounds of so-and-so, it magically shows up 3 days later, voila. I was at an auto parts aerospace company, I'm sorry. So aerospace polymer seals and gaskets have very complex formularies for the resins and material that they make. They go into planes. They're very resistant. They have to have massive temperature changes. There's very complex formulas for how they make it. And then there's a very long approval process in the US and Europe for that part. So if you take a piece out, they have to technically get that part recertified. So we have a complicated thing where you're not going to go, could take 6 months, it could be hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to get a part recertified. And if you need a tiny container of stuff that happens to come from Kazakhstan and it's $1,000 a bottle and it goes to 10,000, you're paying it. You don't have a choice. And there's probably no one else who can make it over, so that's kind of the interesting thing of how that plays out over the coming years and trying to have substitutes and formularies. And I don't think that problem's solved overnight. I think COVID had brought this on, and I think now this tariffs are making it even worse. It's sort of further pushing it as an issue.
So you expect that the geopolitical overlay will remain because it needs to settle itself. And as we've said, or at least in the past we've discussed this, it's very hard to actually have a take, an expertise on, geopolitics. I mean, that's not what you and I do. But is that going to be the ultimate driver for investments and for, are we going to go left or right? And if so, that's not a skill set that we have? Does it then diminish our skill set that we have once you have decided you go left or right?
I mean, look, I mean, this sounds a little self-serving, but the more chaos, the better it is for both of us. Because in a terrible way, because we're the guys who clean up stuff, and we are the guys who try to keep things held together, and that's kind of what we've signed up for and what we love to do. I do think we're going to have a bifurcated world, on some regards, but at the end of the day, China may hate us, we may hate China. They're still going to sell, like they still want to sell, and we still want to buy certain products. We might get a little bit more picky over time, but there's still going to be the politicians yelling at themselves on this level, and then on another level, they're shipping containers back and forth across the sea and not talking about it. So I think there's going to be an aspect of, like, we are a global world now. We have to kind of figure out a way to work together. When I was a kid and went to Europe, I mean, kids in Europe dressed totally different from kids in America. I mean, now you go around the world and fashion is global. Every product you buy is global. If you go to the US or you go to Europe or you go to Asia, you see the same things everywhere. It's not as bifurcated. And I don't think that's just going to turn over overnight. I think people like to get Italian olive oil and Japanese soy sauce. There's a lot of...
or French cognac. Yeah,
exactly.
I understand. So maybe just coming full circle. One thing, we're in a space where cross-border has, over the last 30 years, increased a lot. And every situation is cross-border. There is, as you know, sort of a universalist approach and a territorial approach towards insolvencies and cross-border insolvencies. Universalist approach being there needs to be one set of rules that actually governs the whole situation, no matter where the assets are of a debtor, in which jurisdiction. And territorialism is the other way, is very much, look, it could be a foreign insolvency, but if there's an asset here in this jurisdiction, you need a separate procedure and, we'll deal with it. But we can't sort of let a foreign liquidator administrator deal with assets in our jurisdiction. And there's a compromise that has been reached and is further developing, the modified universalism, which is a little bit of both, right? We're aiming to be as universalist as possible, but we modify it for certain things where we believe it's important to have our own sovereignty. Looking at the global sort of stage, where it looks like globalization is on the retreat and we're very much focused on our sovereignty, our territory, do you think that something like that is going to translate itself also in our space, that we're going to go more and more away from cross-border insolvency being universalist, or as universalist as we possibly can be, and we're going to go back to actually we're going to sort things out in our own jurisdiction, and our sovereignty, our territorial approach is going to basically dominate?
I think the push and pull is going to continue, and I think it's going to be a way. The beautiful part is that INSOL has, 70 plus countries or more agreed to a model law and a rule, where you have certain countries, let's say China with Evergrande, where a lot of their debt is issued in an offshore instrument that allows them to say, well, we're not going to allow the money to get out of China. So they're saying, like, we're universal, but we're really not. So I think a lot of these things are going to be tested over the coming years, and unfortunately are often tested when someone loses a lot of money or can't get their money back. And because there is a lot of money sloshing around the world, that may solve some of the problems, because you might be able to sell to somebody in that country or do something to prop up a company that's in trouble. But I think it's going to get hotter. I think more and more people are going to play hide the ball for a while. But I think there's also an acknowledgement that whether you like it or not, we are a global economy.
No, and that will stay. But okay, it's not going to get easier. It's going to be more complex and more difficult, and we're not going to have uniform insolvency law across the board, across the world. We're going to stick with national insolvency laws and dealing with territories and trying to make sense of cross-border situations the best we can.
Right. I think in most situations, what ultimately, and you're the attorney who's in court arguing this stuff every day, is like, look, it's worse for the company if we don't agree to do this. And this plan is the best for all creditors on your side and both sides. That's why we're putting forth this plan. And if you can say, well, this guy's going to benefit, but you're going to get screwed, of course they're going to pull back on you. So I think the ability of professionals who like us, like we've worked on cases all over the world, and we're used to going and having these conversations and taking the time to learn these things. So we're kind of comfortable with it. I don't think a lot of people are, but I think they're going to have to get a lot more comfortable a lot more quickly than in the past.
Hey, Rich, you've been very, very generous with your time. I think we've done quite a gallop around a lot of things in our space. Maybe the last sort of, question I have for you is if there are sort of young people that are thinking about going into special situations, being a practitioner, maybe more on your side or on my side, what would be sort of the advice that you would give them based on your experience so far?
I don't know if I would, at least from the U.S. financial, like go to work for a restructuring firm in the U.S. I don't know if I would say that. Largely because I think a lot of times I might say go work for a lender, go work in-house, go to a private equity firm where you have some operational experience, where you could work with, you're an operating partner, you work with the companies. Because I think they're doing what we used to do. We used to fix the company. PE funds buy 10 companies, glue them together, and then try to make it work. I think there's a value for that skill. And so I think the people who are in PE now are doing a lot of what we used to do from the outside. So I might say do that, but I would say do not shy away from any opportunity to get into that skill set. I think it's very valuable. You learn a lot in a very short period of time.
That's right. Well, and I guess, you show that with your career path. And maybe I show it also to a certain extent with my career path, where we're both sort of available for interim roles inside the company as well, not necessarily always outside the company advising. And again, if you're one of the stakeholders and you bring somebody in to fix things from within, that is where the action takes place, is what you're saying.
Correct. And I'm curious, do you think it's different in Europe? If you were giving advice to a young person who wanted to go into this industry in Europe, do you feel that, what would you say, Peter?
I don't necessarily disagree. I mean, you need to get a skill set. And where are you going to get the skill set? It could be in a stakeholder, somebody who actually buys up situations and restructures them and is a stakeholder, or you can go into a law firm that has a dedicated group that does it, or a boutique firm that only does this. I think a boutique firm only doing that is going to be difficult for more junior people because you don't have the infrastructure to actually get the education which the larger shops have. So if it's an interest, I mean, you need to see where are you going to get your skill set. Your route is, as good a route as the more traditional route of the advisory firms, where you can, get a good experience, get skills, and then decide what is best for you, going further into, I guess, the career path within a large institution, or do something else in that same space. And there are, many opportunities.
Agreed.
All right, we're back. We got disconnected. There was a technical glitch, but we sorted it out. Obviously, it was inevitable that would happen. It was a test of our resilience, but I guess we passed that. And where we left it was some advice for younger people that consider a career in special sits and, the distressed space. There's actually two thoughts that I wanted to, contribute and maybe try to connect some of the dots that we, had earlier on in the conversation. I think one is the point that you made. You need to like what you're doing if you want to have longevity in special sits. At times it is, pretty full on, and that comes with a price, especially if you're not careful and if you're not aware. And your advice, Rich, was, I think spot on, is have open communications and transparency with your spouse or significant other. Mm-hmm. But my experience is, even if you're forewarned, it's not always easy. Even if you know that right. There is the rat race, there is the hamster wheel, there are the dangers, you don't necessarily always see the signs. And one thing that, I've sort of learned, I always thought that if I do things with the right intentions, then surely, it will be fine. But my intentions are not always visible to, the spouse or significant other. They see my actions, and they will judge my actions according to, what they believe. Which, brings us back to the point that you made. Open communication and transparency. Very, very important. But again, not very easy, especially if you're not home and you're away a lot. But you need to be aware of it. I think the second point I wanted to bring up, and it's sort of, when you were talking about the adrenaline rush that, a special SIDS job can bring. It reminded me of a movie, the movie The Hurt Locker. I don't know if you remember the movie. That is a movie about a bomb disposal guy, right. Who's very successful, very weird in his own way, but does the job and does it very well. And he does it for the right intentions, right? He does it obviously to save people, but he also wants to be back with his family. That is the whole aim. He wants to survive, his job. But then, if he goes back to his family, he sees that it is just such a huge difference between, his job, the high adrenaline, and then the pedestrian daily life in family. And I think, look, we're not bomb disposal guys, but there is a little bit of a similarity there. You need to be very careful that if you go from, a big job, 24/7, go, 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 and then, take some time off at the family, it's a big difference. And, it's all about balance in life. And the balance that you strike, is different in the beginning of your career, middle of your career, and later of your career. And it changes all the time. But you do need to be aware of it. And I think, that is what we've discussed in bits and pieces previously. But I think it's also something for young people to be aware of. I think one maybe final question that I thought I wanted to bring up with you is, if I speak with my two, sons, 2022, it seems like this generation is also very much focused on what's the why? Why are you doing what you're doing? And to be really honest, at the age of my sons, I wasn't really thinking about that. But, is there a why for you to do what you're doing? And what is it?
All right, good question. No, and it's funny, there definitely is a generational difference now, and I notice with young people, and I think that's also changed in how we manage people. But the why I do what I do is because I love what I do. I like to help people. I like to learn and solve problems and fix things. And that's just how I'm wired. I love to dive in and to deal with situations, even if they're messy. And that's part of why I think a lot of the people in our industry like that. My analogy earlier of an attorney, you go, yeah, you can do printing press leases every day. All you're going to do is printing press leases, and you'll know the little, or airplane leases, and you'll know the little quirks in those contracts very, very, very well. But it might be a little boring, where a restructuring attorney has to be much broader in their scope. I think with a young person today, in the U.S. at least, because the U.S. is not the same as the rest of the world, because the big four are largely blocked from doing meaningful restructuring work in the U.S. That was a big training ground for a lot of people.
And it was big four accountancy firms, you mean, right?
Correct.
PwC, EY, Deloitte, KPMG.
Correct. And that was it. Look, it was a big boon for Blackstone and Lazard and Alvarez and Alex Zolfo, because they could just pick off these highly trained people.
Yep.
Yeah, they could pick up these highly trained people that someone else paid to train and develop. It was like kind of a great thing for them. It was unusual, a benefit for them, not at the expense of the big four. But I don't think that's an option really anymore, at least in the U.S. I would say, look, go into consulting, go into banking, go into private equity, see what you like. But I do think the why of why you're doing it. I like the operation side. I'm drawn to that. Some people love the deal. They love to be at a PE fund and they're constantly chasing and scrubbing and trying to close deals. A lot of PE funds won't take anybody who hasn't worked in investment banking before. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy. But again, if you don't love what you do, it's going to be hard. But I do think also that first job really sets the tone. On your comment about the spouse, I remember, and your time, when you go into professional services, when one goes into professional services, it's a lot of time, and we work very hard. We're often compensated appropriately for that, but we're often, it's a lot of work. And a teacher of mine in grad school said, write down the 5 things that you like to do, cross out the bottom 3, and when you work in professional services, you'll be able to do 1, maybe 2 of them. And none of us really liked that, but I have to say it was actually kind of true. It's unlikely you're going to be a scratch golfer, a pro tennis player, a marathon runner, and do karate, and then gourmet cooking. Like you don't have enough free time. So if you want to play golf, that's your thing, just golf or tennis or whatever it is. But don't try to do all, because you're not going to do them very well. Because people who do work only 40 hours a week, they'll be able to do all that stuff all they want, but that's not going to be the case for anyone in our industry.
No. And outside of the professional sort of focus, what are the things that you sort of enjoy? And obviously, as we said, both of us, you see yourself, being around for a while. What's sort of the next thing on your, horizon? Are you continue to do the interim roles? Is there something else that you may want to do over time?
Look, I'm going to continue to do the interim roles. I love that work. I'll continue to do the regular mainstream consulting work. That's always fun. I could do that all day long. The third thing I think I want to get more into is board work. I do some board work now, mostly with nonprofits, but want to be more on a for-profit board. I think it's a very natural fit for anyone in our industry. We've seen everything. Obviously, they would probably put me on a board where there'd be kind of some industry match and probably with a bit of a distressed angle, because the typical board simply isn't they're not comfortable working through some of the issues and challenges. And the larger corporate deals, I mean, the big funds write letters to each of the board members sent to their home saying why all of your fiduciary obligation is to them, whether they are in the money or not. And so a lot of board members get very threatened and scared by these things. So having someone who knows can help walk the board through a challenging situation, I think is very handy. And that's a lot of fun. I think that's right in your or my wheelhouse.
Excellent. Well, look, I think we need to land the plane. We've been on it for a while. I think we've, covered a lot. There is obviously a lot more to cover. You can go in a lot more detail. But I want to thank you very much for the conversation. I greatly appreciated it. I enjoyed it. And, I hope the listeners that, got as far as this, have also enjoyed the conversation. And stay tuned for the next one. And bye-bye, everybody.